time I went through and counted, I counted 75, but in this Bible that I have, 73 are attributed to David. Now, that's not to say that for whatever reason, well, okay, let me say this. That's not necessarily to say that he did write all those, because those superscriptions are not inspired. In the Psalms, whenever you look and it says a Psalm of David, the Holy Spirit didn't do that, but somebody did, and somebody a long time ago did. So I think they're probably trustworthy. Some of them are obviously David, but that's the exception rather than the rule, extreme exception. But David, I've got 73. I counted 73. I've got them listed. I think I listed them. I thought I did in the handout. Added a little thing. Psalms 3 through 9. And then 10 is not attributed to him. And then 11 through 32 is all David. And then 33 isn't attributed to David. Then 34 through 41 is all David. Then 51 through 65, 68 through 70, 86, 101, 103, 108 through 110. And so I listed all the Psalms that are attributed to David. So really, when we study David, you would want to study half of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, and then the Psalms, because what better way to get inside the character and mind of a man than to read the stuff he wrote? So even more than we can learn a lot from what whoever wrote 1 and 2 Samuel said about David, but I think we can learn just as much about David from what David wrote. Mm-hmm.
Like the songs we just sang, according to ESV, 132 times the heart was mentioned in the Psalms. So a lot of those would have been David and the others who wrote. It was David that God said he was a man after his own heart.
Mm-hmm.
And that really is where all of our work has to be done, is in the heart of man. And so
Yep.
songs have a tendency to stick in that area.
Yeah, and that may be one reason why they're so popular among some people. I think it's been my observation, I guess my opinion, that sometimes the Psalms are overemphasized among some circles, because you would think that, you get the impression, and they may even admit, that's all they really ever read is the Psalms. And I think there's a problem with that. And when that's all you read, that's a problem. They should definitely be read because they are inspired, first of all, but also because there's so much in there that we could almost try to make. It came from the heart of the one who wrote it, but it should, over time, sort of become what our heart, what's in our hearts too. And reading and meditating on it can help in that process. Mm-hmm.
But that is the problem. The Psalms is the heart of man, and how David dealt with his heart and how the Psalms were written. But to know the heart of God, you have to know the entire Word.
Yeah.
In other words, it's two different focuses.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And
But we learn by example. So that's how a godly man did. That would be for my heart.
yeah, that would be a good example. A good example is always a good example to follow. No matter who it is, if it's a good example, then they should be followed and imitated. Another good thing about going to the Psalms, just to sort of circle back to something I referenced in Bible class this morning, some of them, I say some, it may not be some, it may just be a couple, but in addition to saying that David wrote it, there are little indicators that are very helpful for a cross-reference type situation. For instance, Psalm 3. Psalm 3 doesn't only say a psalm of David. It says, when he fled from Absalom, his son. You want to write 2 Samuel 15 out by that, because that is extra information and extra insight into 2 Samuel 15. 2 Samuel 15 records when David fled from Absalom, but it doesn't record what David wrote during that time. So that little superscription, again, not inspired, but ancient, we could say, tells us, gets us inside the mind of David during that time. And there are other instances like that. I'm not sure if it was pertaining to David, or I think it was David, actually. One of the occasions when Saul had trapped him in his house. Let's see if I can. Oh, here's another one. Psalm 34. In the instance when David started acting like a crazy person, Psalm 34 says that he wrote this in that time, during that time period, so that he would tell him to go away. The superscription here says Abimelech, but I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head. All I know is I saw that said before Abimelech, but.
But some writers say Psalm 77 was written by David whenever he lost the son in Bathsheba conceived, because it is really a psalm of repentance until you get halfway through, and then he remembers 77.
77 says it's a psalm of Asaph, but.
But Asaph means it wasn't a person.
It wasn't a person?
Not according to the ESV. A psalm of Asaph, the mighty one, God the Lord speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting. And when you read the whole chapter, that's a song. The guy he can't even sleep at night. He is so depressed. And he's reaching out until he remembers the mighty one.
Yeah.
And then it gives him strength back.
Well, I mean, whether it was about that situation or not, it still has the same power. I would say Asaph would have, it's implied that he is a person, because some psalms say a psalm of David, other ones say a psalm of Asaph. So it seems to be, and they're not the only ones. Solomon wrote one of them. That's 72, by the way. Moses wrote at least one. I still haven't found the one that is going to pertain to one of the things we'll look at here. In David's earlier life. I just saw the one about when he acted like a crazy person, to put it one way. I could have sworn that there was one when David was trapped. Maybe I skipped over it. However, I did also see one in passing there that was when Nathan came and confronted him. That's Psalm 51. Now, it's probably, we might assume that he wrote that around that time anyway, if you read the psalm. But the superscription says that it is directly a result of when Nathan went to him after he had gone into Bathsheba. So if anybody happens to find a psalm that says that it was written whenever David was trapped by Saul and had to be let... Maybe that's what I'm thinking of then. Oh, wait a minute. And 54 says something like that too. When the Ziphites went and told Saul, "Is not David hiding among us in the cave?" I think. So maybe those are the two I'm thinking of. So little things like that are helpful, because those are things that are recorded elsewhere. So I would recommend and encourage you to write where those are written. So 1 Samuel 21 and 22 goes with Psalm 52, and 1 Samuel 23. Psalm 52 goes with 1 Samuel 21 and 22. Oh, okay, when he was in the cave. So that also might be 1 Samuel 22. So another one about that. Or it could be chapter 24, but probably 22. So those things are, I mean, if you're ever studying or reading 1 Samuel 22, for instance, I would also write those Psalms out by 1 Samuel 22 because it's just gets you even more into the scene and it allows you to see inside the mind of David. Just like I believe Psalm 23 is almost a prophetic picture inside the mind of Christ when he's hanging on the cross, because it's obviously messianic, and it'll just give you chills if you read Psalm 23 in view of the cross, because they're circling around me, mocking me, laughing at me. They're like dogs. I mean, it's incredible. So, David, in a nutshell, his legacy, well, he had a pretty big legacy. He was a shepherd, he was a warrior, he was a king, he was a prophet, one of the only people, the only king of Israel who was also a prophet. Son, brother, friend, husband, father, musician, songwriter, poet, giant slayer, man of God. He was the youngest of 8 sons of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, and he was the second and arguably the greatest of Israel's kings. One of the most prominent figures in the history of the world. Not just the history of the Bible, but the history of the world for that reason. So David, obviously, there's no better way to refer to him than the man after God's own heart. That is probably his legacy. If anything is his legacy, being called, not just being called the man after God's own heart, but being called by God the man after God's own heart. That, I can't imagine, biggest compliment anybody could ever receive. God calls you a man after my own heart. Can't get any better than that. And there are some pretty big compliments of people in the scriptures. Could also probably throw in Ruth chapter 4, because that is some of the lineage of David. He was the grandson of, let me get it right here. Once we start going into family trees, my brain gets kind of scrambled. Let's see, chapter 4, verse 17 says, not the right book. Here we go, chapter 4, verse 17. Obed is Naomi's son, who was Jesse's dad, making him David's granddad. So the story that unfolds in the book of Ruth, the situation there with Ruth, I should say. Obed was David's grandfather. And then that's why that's recorded in Ruth chapter 4. The father of David, well, if you're just reading through the narrative here, you don't even know who David is because you hadn't got to David yet. But the reason that's recorded is to show, it really kind of gives the purpose of the book of Ruth. One of the purposes is here's how David came about. And then 16 chapters later, David, you're gonna meet David and see why it was a big enough deal to record the background of his birth. Mm-hmm. It's what it seems like, yeah. He had that to his name also, that he had killed a lion. As a shepherd, I guess, is probably the way that would have unfolded. Part of his duties as a shepherd would be protecting from predators, and on one occasion, it seems a lion was one of those predators. Not a fight I would want to get into, but yeah, he probably did. That seemed to be his weapon of choice, which was pretty normal for people in his position and in that part of the world. I mean, it's not like a little kid with a little slingshot. I mean, you can do some damage with a kid with a little slingshot, could hurt somebody, but the way they used them, it was lethal. I mean, they were so good at it, and, it was meant to be a weapon. It wasn't meant to be a toy. So he probably used that.
When Saul was leading one of his campaigns against the Philistines, we read that the Israelites didn't have swords and spears.
Yeah.
Because Philistines didn't allow them to have blacksmiths.
Yep. Took all the blacksmiths.
So they had to have something to fight with other than normal.
Yeah. Yeah, and for a shepherd protecting sheep, if I was good with it, I'd rather have a sling than a sword. If I'm going to have to fight a lion, I'd rather do it with a sling than a sword. For the same reason, I'd rather do it with a gun than a sword. Yeah, just keep your distance. Or he probably didn't have he probably never went out, shepherding in the field, going with the sheep, which remember wasn't just an afternoon of work. We learned from, Joseph and his brothers, they would be gone for days at a time, going with the sheep, wherever the sheep roam, you go with them. It probably would have been more used under normal circumstances just to ward them off, scare them off, get them to, give them a big thonk in the head with a, stone from that sling, they'll probably run off. But I guess on that occasion, that day, the lion was extra hungry or something. So David comes into the picture in 1 Samuel 16 as a result. If you remember, talk about drilling what chapters are about in our heads. 1 Samuel 15 is a very important chapter. It's when Saul messed up big time, and God, through Samuel, told Saul, that's it. I regret that I've made you the king. I'm taking it from you and giving it to somebody else. That's 1 Samuel 15. So Saul, kingdom taken from Saul. It wasn't yet taken from him, but it was announced that it would be taken from him. So that's 1 Samuel 15. Then in chapter 16, when we meet David, it was because Samuel was supposed to go and anoint him as king before we don't even know who he is. Samuel doesn't even know who he is. God just told him, I know the man who's going to take Saul's place. It's not going to be his son, which is how it would naturally be, and would have been if Saul had been faithful. But I'm going to replace the dynasty of Saul, and I've got the man picked out. So you go to Bethlehem and go anoint him. So here he goes, and as the story unfolded, Jesse had 8 sons. Samuel shows up. He says, God tells him, by the way, don't look at his appearance. Don't look at his height. Now, why would he say those things? Saul, as we've talked about before, he had that look. I don't know what that look is, but Saul had it. He's very handsome, head above everybody else. So don't go for the look. Jehovah sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but Jehovah looks on the heart. So Jesse called the 7 of his sons, and each time, nope, not him. That's not him. That's not him. They get through all 7 of them. Samuel asks Jesse, are these all your sons? All I know is Jehovah's told me that your son is who I'm here for. Are these all of them? He said, well, I do have another son. He's out with the sheep. Brings him in. Now, ironically, even though he said don't look on his appearance, David comes in. We don't know how old he was at this time. He was the youngest. That's all we know. Says he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. 3 things, okay? Of course, what God said still stood because God wasn't picking him because he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. But he happened to be. So God tells Samuel, that's him. That's him right there. That's the one. Apparently, even though he was handsome, maybe other things about him, mainly probably his age, Samuel wouldn't have expected David to have been the one, probably. But he was, so he anoints him. And at that point, it says, and the Spirit of Jehovah rushed upon David from that day forward. Samuel gets up and leaves. So this is, at this point, that was the end of it. David doesn't go with Samuel. Samuel just goes back home at Ramah. Now, we learn that Saul was having some difficulties of some kind. Probably God providentially working to bring David to Saul, to the royal court. Harmful spirit was tormenting him. Turns out the son of Jesse, this Bethlehemite, is pretty good at playing the lyre. L-Y-R-E. David, I hate to burst anybody's bubble. David didn't play the harp. At least the harp that what we know of as a harp isn't the thing that David would have played. It would have been maybe similar to that, plucking of strings, but from what I've seen and heard, it was actually, I think, musically closer to an acoustic guitar than a harp. The thing the angels play, right? Well, that remains to be seen also. But anyway, yep.
My mom used to have, it was very old, maybe her grandmother or great-grandmother, but it was a lap harp that sat on the lap, and you're right, it was similar to a guitar, but it was plucked with strings. And we used to do destroy the band, they had it, but it was a really old instrument piece.
Yeah, that would be a
And it was called
a lap. It was called a lap harp. I've never heard them called that, but I have heard them called other names. But David, whatever it was, he was good at it. So is that it? That looks like a harp, to be honest. But
I don't know, it looks much smaller to me, like it might be held in the lap rather than
yeah.
on a big stand.
Yeah, I guess you would have to go back in time and see exactly how they would have played it. History is interesting in that way. Just like the dinosaur skeletons they find, they have to sort of piece them together and try to figure out what this may have been, what this flap thing may have, been. And they just have to guess. Well, you find ancient instruments that that aren't used anymore. You just kind of have to assume how they played it and maybe recreate one and assume that that's what they used to sound like, even though it may not be. But David was good at it, and they said, I bet if we get him in here to play, then it'll soothe the king's soul or whatever. And that's how David came to be in the royal court of Saul. Whenever the harmful spirit, and every time it says the harmful spirit came from God. God did this to Saul. So God was doing this, it seems to me, to get David there. That's how he providentially got David to the royal court. Because what other purpose or role would David as shepherd have in the royal court? But this was the perfect way to get him there. Mm-hmm.
I think it is a disease that all men have for unrepentant sins. When you look at how Saul dealt with, every time he was confronted with his sin, he never went to God. He tried to blame it on others. He tried to hide it. And I think every person who does not deal appropriately with the sin in their life, they will be disturbed individuals until they die.
I think that's true. I don't think that's what was happening to Saul, because the text says that it was a harmful spirit from God that tormented him.
That means another one comes in, yeah?
Yeah, but the book, it says that it came from God.
Well, in 2 Thessalonians, and God sends them strong delusions if
Yeah.
they don't believe the truth. Everything comes from God, but it's because they rejected it.
Okay, but it still says that it was a harmful spirit from God. Huh? Okay. It's not just the servants that said that. Now, if verse 16 was the only verse that said that, then it would be more open for question, and verse 15, because they're saying that, and they might have been wrong. But the man who wrote 1 Samuel also says in verse 14 and in verse 23 that it was a harmful spirit from God that came upon him, which is a little bit stronger language than
Is it stronger
others.
than what they said about Pharaoh?
Yes.
That
Well, some of the times it says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. So, well, I think it was God providentially bringing David into the court, because that's what happened. That's what came about from this. So when it says that there was a harmful spirit from Jehovah tormenting him, and the result of this was David comes to the court. It so happened to be the young man that God had chosen to be the next king. Seems like that's clearly what the goal was in this. So he's there, but he's just there to play his instrument to make the king feel better whenever he's in a bad mood or whatever. That's probably what it would have looked like from the outside. But in chapter 17 then, it seems at that point also he wasn't there permanently, but he would come in and come and go. But his brothers were sort of enlisted in the military of the Israelites, and he had come in to bring them some food, some things from Dad. Their packed lunches, and go ahead, Dean. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Play on music?
No, sing. Sing Jesus loves me. With little children, if they're upset, if you sing to them, it calms them down. Unless there's something, a need that needs to be attended to. But generally speaking, if a baby's aggravated or upset, you just sing and laugh.
Yeah. I don't know if there could ever be an answer found, but there is something to be said, and it would be a fascinating study if we could find the answer, of the connection between music and the human soul. Because it is, if you think about it, music is the only universal language that has ever existed. Now, sure, music is different, the way the music sounds, but it's all still music. So the music itself, it can move a person, even if there are words and the words are in a foreign language, you could still be moved by the music. So, in Saul's favor, it worked. It soothed him. Now, David comes to bring the things for his brothers, and at this time the camps were sort of there, and there's this giant, a Philistine, very large man, and that's an understatement, who was mocking them and taunting them and challenging them to single combat, which is basically, hey, we don't have to fight. If one of you if y'all want to name somebody and fight me, that'll take care of this battle. And only one man has to die, and obviously from his perspective, it's going to be your guy. So when you got a 9'6" guy to fight, nobody's going to take up that challenge. What do you think, we're stupid? We're not going to fight, we're not going to do one-on-one when your guy is 9'6". Well, David shows up, and let's see, verse 26, it says, the men said to him in verse 25, have you seen this man, this guy, what he's doing? Have you seen this, heard this? Can you believe this? Said the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And they told him, and then his oldest brother, he didn't like this too much. This is one of those things that just seems so realistic today, relatable. Because older brothers, or siblings in general, are going to be annoyed with their younger siblings, almost no matter what they do. Well, here's young brother, little brother, the baby brother, and he's asking around about this Philistine, and his oldest brother was mad. Baby brother's messing everything up. They were there. They were men. They were here at the army, and baby brother's just, go home. Get out of here. And David's like, what have I done? We're just talking. That's a paraphrase of verse 29. That's what he said. We're just talking. But then he goes to Saul, and he says, let no man's heart fail because of him. I'll go and fight him. Saul told him, you're not able to go against him. You're just a youth. He's been a man of war from his youth. David said, well, I used to keep sheep, and this is where he says, if there ever came a lion or a bear or a lamb who took a lamb from the flock, I went after him, struck him, delivered him out of his mouth. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. He said, Jehovah, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So Saul said, all right, whatever. Go on. Put on some armor. Didn't work out. Can't help but mention, it doesn't say that it was too big. Doesn't say his armor was too big. He says, I haven't tested them. I haven't practiced with this stuff on. Yeah, he was a youth, but that doesn't mean he was a 12-year-old. That's a bit of a stretch. He wasn't used to wearing armor. Why would a shepherd be used to wearing battle armor? So, long story short, he goes out, kills him. That's the short version. Exactly what he said would happen, happened. God was with him, struck him down. Now, guess what? David is the most famous man in the whole country. Because he was the man who, the shepherd boy, it's just like, the classic underdog story. He's a nobody. He's not just young, he's a nobody. From Bethlehem. Really, Bethlehem? It's like being from Allenville. Somebody from Allenville goes to New York City, and does some great thing that everybody hears about. You mean this young person from where? Allentown? Allenville? Shepherd? Or a farmer? Or, anything that, some people would look as a lower than, in their big, pride. So he's the most famous man in the country. Nobody, young man, he's now the hero of the nation. And he forged a crucial friendship with the king's son, Jonathan. Saul, however, wasn't a fan. He was not a fan. That's going to unfold more. But at first, it seemed to be working out because Saul seems to have no choice but to take him in as a permanent. Now he's in the royal city for good. And he's just going to have him doing whatever he tells him to do. And it says that he did go out, and wherever the king sent him, he was successful, so that he set him over the men of war. But as time goes on, Saul is going to not like David too much. But what's so powerful about that is that Jonathan, this is where we meet, or at least really get to meet Saul's son Jonathan, who we learned was totally different than his dad. Because if anybody was going to hate David more than Saul started to hate David, it would have been Jonathan. Because Jonathan should have been the next king. And once they find out that he's going to be the next king, nobody would hate David more than Jonathan. Because that's supposed to be mine. But Jonathan, chapter 18, verse 1 says, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And that never stopped. No matter what David did, you know why? Because Jonathan, he had a good heart and a godly heart. And so he didn't see David as a threat. He saw David as a man of God. And somebody that he wanted to be friends with and close to. So they made a covenant together. And again, it says he loved him as his own soul. And that's where it all starts to go downhill for David. And this is why I said it's going to take more than one lesson, because that's as far as we're going to take it today. Dean, do you have something?
Well, to think of this, the relationship between David and Jonathan, like you said, he would have been next in line. And of course, to me, it seems like, too, maybe Jonathan knew anything, knew what his dad had done. And he knew, I don't know, maybe he knew about that, he wasn't going to leave, and God or told Saul that he removed him as king, maybe, I don't, Jonathan might have known that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so to God that felt that, he still seemed, David.
Yeah, and some commentators and scholars think that verse 4 of chapter 18 is an indication that Jonathan did know. When it says that he stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt, some interpret that as Jonathan sort of saying, I know that you're the next. I know that you are special, and that it's almost like a token that he knew he was the next, he would be the next king. It doesn't say that, but that's possible, because it doesn't give an explanation for what he was symbolizing by that gesture. If that was part of the covenant or something, it leaves it open. But it may be that Jonathan knew that something bigger was going on here in the unfolding of this young man rising to power. Yeah. Yeah. Because of personal things. Yeah. And this would have been real personal for Jonathan, like I said, because he's the son, the heir. But in the same way that David respected the choice of Saul, or the continued choice of Saul, Jonathan respected the following choice of David. So they had that in common, that God's will is best. And if this is what God wants, that's what David kept having to tell his men when they were like, that would have been so tempting. This is God giving him into your hand. This is your moment. Strike. Nope. If God wants him dead, he's perfectly capable of killing him. He's God's anointed. I ain't touching him. So Jonathan had that same mindset. If you are God's anointed, then you're my anointed. And so much power in David and Jonathan's friendship. There's not a whole lot of detail. We just get these little snippets, but the snippets are enough to see how important Jonathan was in David's life, and vice versa, but especially for David. He was with him, never showed any bias because of his dad. He was always on the side of right, like we talked about this morning.
It shows both of their relationship with God. I mean, David wasn't just out as a shepherd boy, moaning and groaning about having to take care of sheep. David saw the glory of God in the heavens. He saw the glory of God in the way he was tending the sheep. I mean, he hadn't tested armor out, but he had, I'm reluctant to use the word tested God out, but he had learned that he could rely on God to take care of his needs like he took care of the sheep. David didn't waste his time. And obviously, Jonathan would have come into contact with the Hebrew teaching of Jehovah God.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed, because my hearing's not that good with what you said, there's a close relationship between faith and faith.
Yep.
The important part, those two had faith in what God said would be done.
Yep. They had that in common too. If God wants it to be done, it's going to be done. So David, he's off to a great start as far as his reputation, his legacy, his faithfulness. He's really outshined everybody else, even in Saul's eyes, because now he's being put over men. Not that long ago, he was he was questioned, or, people were wondering if he should even be allowed to take part in this fight. Now he's being set over men of war, and everybody was happy about it. But as we continue on, and hopefully we'll be able to finish this in one more lesson. I don't see any reason to rush it if not. But he keeps going up until his whole world comes crashing down because of sin. And so many strong, powerful lessons to learn from the life of David, which is why we're going to take our time getting through. But at this point, one of the lessons that we should learn is the same lesson we've learned from several of the other characters. Our faith in God should outweigh always our fear of anything else. So for David, it was Goliath, or the lion and the bear, for that matter. Our faith in God should be stronger than our fear of whatever. And David definitely showed that, and he would continue to show that in his life. That's one reason why he's a man after God's own heart.